I remember the first diagram that I ever consciously saw, and it was a kind of diagram of the kind of city of Rotterdam, which had been bombed by the Germans in 1940. And basically the city was grey, and there was a kind of big white crater of everything that was destroyed. That was for me a kind of incredibly interesting document because it told the whole story without words and without melodrama, without self-pity, without any kind of further emotion. It was just a kind of pure representation of something that had happened.
We discussed several strategies on how to introduce the exhibition to the visitor before the visitor would actually see the content in the exhibition itself. At some point it became quite evident that the diagrams was a form that we had used in the process, and then like a more refined version of them that became also the way of introducing the exhibition itself.
In the last 2 to 3 centuries, we see a huge increase of the use of images for communication with people, for thinking, for learning as well. The visual literacy is high right now. Diagrams are not, in essence, neutral. They bring forward the ideas from the perspective of the author and the time period. Because society changes, also the way, the form of diagrams changes.
At some point I needed a language that was unconventional and not necessarily architectural, but also a language that didn't need, again, hundreds of words. So then the diagram becomes a kind of very key element of how we communicated to each other, but also how we could invent new things. In certain kind of representations you see the world, and you see kind of, for instance, how different parts of the world interact and where there are kind of lines of tension.
The main framework of the exhibition is to look at diagrams under the lens of urgencies, and the exhibition is arranged around 9 main urgencies that have been selected, and among which there is built environment, health, war, migration, environment. And then the general organization is that there is the central space where each of the urgency is organized in one table, and then there is this enfilade of the 9 tables representing the 9 urgencies. We play with this idea of the library, so that there is this sequence of tables, very regular, that bring their own lighting, and then it has this library kind of configuration in the space. And then on the perimeter of the exhibition there is a series of zooms or focus room, which are born out of some of the patterns of some of the specific authors that had emerged during the research.
We chose to showcase several specific authors within the exhibition because it's important to give face to the makers of diagrams. We can see the development of change in diagrams through society in the diagrams, for example, by William Playfair, how he introduces a new form of graphic, and he explains that also in his diagrams so that his readers can understand.
I kind of personally am very fascinated by a series of diagrams that were produced by a black professor in 1900, Dubois, who described the situation of what were then called Negroes in America. That material is incredibly compelling in terms of the clarity and the ability to represent again a pretty dramatic situation without words and with the clarity of a diagram that doesn't need words, doesn't need rhetoric, doesn't need anything else.
The diagrams made by Emma Willard. She was an educator in the 19th century. She wanted young girls to be able to learn history, and what she did was making diagrams with big timelines and big sheets where she put all the information of names, empires, kings, popes in one diagram. This was extremely important at the time, and we can also still understand why it was important, that it's important to teach children, women especially, and girls.
I think it's quite interesting that in the exhibition we have mix of original and reproduction materials. A lot of the contemporary ones are also diagrams that are born to be seen on a screen. So then that kind of, we wanted everything to be printed or as much as possible on a printed form. The goal is not really to try to recreate a full story about health or a full story about built environment, but it's really to collect or to bring together like a number of pieces that it shows different moments in histories and different way of looking at certain topics in moment in history.
The diagrams have been used through the ages, through time, by people to think. You can think through it. You can abstract complex thoughts and put them on paper. Even though it's a visual form, we can still think about them as rhetorical tools to make a statement, to argue for something, to convince other people. It's not only neutral facts that are depicted in a diagram, quite the opposite. Diagrams are often seen as boring, as something that is not necessarily beautiful to look at. To see the whole range of diagrams we find here, I think it's clear that the makers of this exhibition have a love for diagrams, for the visual aspect of it, for the aesthetic. So apparently there's an aesthetic pleasure in looking at these diagrams in a different way than when they're very static.
I think it's been quite interesting to define what is a beautiful diagram, because sometimes it's the artistic quality of that stands out, but sometimes it's really simply the way that the information are gathered together and it kind of becomes this communication tool.
Yeah. So I think that the clarity in itself is beautiful, and if clarity, no matter how it manifests itself, I think it triggers an effect of beauty. By doing this exhibition, we also discovered a kind of deep history that we were only partly aware of, and also a discovery that in every culture diagrams exist, and that it's therefore genuinely a universal language. For me, the beauty is no words, total clarity, and potentially something that has never been thought before.